All right, everybody, welcome back. Good to see you guys, and I'm glad that you're watching right now. This is the newest installment for our ethics class here, and this is lecture number 10. I'm picking up where we left off last time on our new topic. So we started this course by basically going over some of the major ethical theories of the West. That's utilitarian ethics as given by John Stuart Mill. And then also we talked about deontology and Kantian style ethics. Its most, of course, primary advocate being Immanuel Kant himself. We studied his ideas on the idea or the concept of what makes an act morally permissible or impermissible. Then we spent significant time talking about the ethics of abortion. We read literature from both pro-choice and pro-life authors. On the one hand, there was the pro-choice arguments of Marianne Warren, Michael Tooley, and Judith Jarvis Thompson. They all make different types of argument, but the gist of Warren's view was that people are members of the moral community and the fetus is not yet a person. Tooley thought that you have to have some awareness of your interests, including the interest in continued existence. Thompson had a novel argument which said that even if the fetus has a personhood and the right to life from the very first moment of conception, that it would still be permissible to abort in a range of cases, as long as there was no right that the fetus had to use the mother's body against her will or without her permission. And she gives a whole bunch of interesting analogies to illustrate that thinking. And we also read pro-life authors, including most notably Don Marquis. In my view, he probably has the strongest of the pro-life arguments anyway. I'm not saying that I'm standing with that conclusion, but it's a decent argument, and it's just the position about how you have a right to life if you could have a future like ours, and terminating a future like ours is what makes killing an adult wrong or any other level of human, as long as that future like ours is possible. And Noonan's view was that conception confers this moral status on the fetus because that's when probabilities change with respect to whether a mature human will eventually be a result. And then now we've turned our attention to the second big topic in the class, which is drugs, the drug policy, legalization, recreational use, and prohibition. I started by just kind of giving you guys a little bit of background on the topic and drug usage rates in our country, as well as, the policy options. And we talked about the differences between criminalization, legalization, decriminalization. We talked about what drugs are, how recreational drug usage is topic of moral debate. And we studied one author that was James Q. Wilson, and his article called Against the Legalization of Drugs, where he basically relies on one of the three principles of criminalization that we discussed, which is the harm principle. There are different principles of criminalization. Those are theories about what makes it justifiable to criminalize some kind of behavior. And one theory is the harm principle, which says that it's only justified to criminalize behavior that could harm others, not the person doing the act, but those affected by the person's actions. And then there's the paternalism principle, which says that it's justifiable to criminalize behavior that is harmful to the individual doing the behavior to protect them, I guess, from their own judgment or bad behavior or poor choices. And then there's the legal moralism principle, which says that it's morally permissible to, or justified anyway, to criminalize conduct, whether it can be established as harmful or not, as long as it's somehow immoral in some sense of the word. So James Wilson tried to make the case that drug usage, specifically, he paid heavy attention to heroin and crack cocaine, but he said drugs like those, for example, are so dangerous because they make the user threatening perhaps to others, either because of erratic, violent, or impulsive behavior, or in some cases, neglect, negligence, inaccuracy with operating machinery or motor vehicles, and inability to raise children or keep a job. So I don't know. Some of those things have only to do with the individual's own life, but there's a lot of them that he thinks could threaten other people, and therefore society can restrict that behavior because it is threatening to others. Anyway, that was kind of his argument. And now we've reached another argument and another author in the same topic. So today we're going to focus on, in this lecture anyway, the writing of Douglas Husak. So this is the author for now. Douglas, first name, Husak, last name. This is a paper of his from 1992, and it's called A Moral Right to Use Drugs. Yeah, some of you may also have watched the little video that I linked to you and sent through Canvas, which was the debate between James Q. Wilson and Ethan Nadelman, who's one of the primary advocates for drug policy reform and decriminalization and things like that. But here's a man that stands kind of, you could say on Nadelman's side of the argument. So Douglas Husak does argue in this paper that we have a moral right to use drugs. And he thinks that that's an extension of the moral right that he believes that we have to individual autonomy, as long as our actions, don't affect other people. So he would argue that to put a substance in your body, maybe it's mind altering, but at the end of the day, that you should be given the liberty as an adult to choose what you'd like to do with your body and mind, as long as it doesn't affect the material interests of other people. So he thinks it violates our moral rights to make drug use illegal. And he's going to hold his position, he thinks, regardless of whether or not there was a fair argument that could establish drug use causes some harm. He thinks whether it causes harm or not, when there are rights that are at stake, rights are supposed to take priority over utility. Now, that's an important concept that I kind of wanted to focus on with you guys for a moment, because it's one of the main themes of his essay, the Douglas Husak essay. And that is this principle, again, that rights are more important than utility, or that they are supposed to be the thing you defer to if there is ever a conflict between rights and utility. Utility then, again, being like from utilitarianism, a maximization of overall happiness or pleasure. So you might say that if we have to choose between promoting the most overall utility or honoring rights, that rights are the things that have to be given priority in that conflict. So that's a statement or phrase that's mentioned sometimes, which is the phrase that rights trump utility. Anyway, just to create a little extra room, I think you've seen the author's name and the title and so forth, so I'm going to clear that away. And now I can have more room to write this little statement. Rights trump utility. That's the phrase, rights trump utility. Now, the word trump, you may associate it with the former president, but it's also a verb, which means that something takes priority or precedence over another thing. So, if you say like family trumps friendships, then you might think that like if you have to honor an obligation to your family or to a friend, that you have to focus on the family member, because you say that takes priority over the other thing. So here, in the same sense, rights trump utility means that if rights and utility cannot both be, promoted in the same case, then it's rights that you have to honor. For example, suppose that you can make an argument that with slavery or something, that even though you're violating human rights, to life and liberty, you're getting a lot of production out of the people that are being forced to work as slaves. That wouldn't be okay, according to this idea, because rights are the things that have to be prioritized, regardless of how much utility you can generate from violating a right. So suppose that one person has a right to life, but I could take their organs out and save 5 other people. You might think that that promotes the most overall utility, in the sense that it causes the most people to survive. But again, it's a violation of the right to life of the one individual, and therefore you might say that's wrong too. So rights trump utility. According to that idea, this author says we have a moral right to use drugs. It's an extension of our liberty rights. It's an extension of our personal autonomy. And so for that reason, he says it's not to be argued on a utilitarian basis. But having said that, though he believes that rights trump utility and that there is a moral right to use drugs, he also does take time in the article to try and make the utilitarian style argument as well. He does not think that the total costs and benefits show that criminalization is the better status quo. So he kind of does both. On the one hand, he tries to argue that it's not actually creating the most overall happiness to have a anti-drug status quo in the law, as opposed to the alternative. But he also thinks that irrespective of that, people do have a right to do things, especially if it's their body and mind that they have the choice to do what they'd like with. So he starts off then by noting that there is a perception in society that drug use is an out of control problem. And because of this perception that it is this big out of control problem, it's triggered a big state response. Drugs, for example, preoccupy our entire criminal justice system. And we spend tens of billions of dollars each year to enforce laws against drugs. He cites some statistics that help to kind of fill out his argument. He mentions that in the year he wrote this, which was 1992, there are 28 million drug users. So I'll put that here in this chat. Okay, so in 1992 figures, which is when he wrote this, the statistic that was given is that there were 28 million drug users and 750,000 approximately will be arrested each year. Okay, so 28 million users, 750,000 arrests. Consider this, between 1/4 and 1/3 of all felony sentences are drug related. So just putting the stats that he's talking about here in the chat bar. So yeah, between 1/4 and 1/3 of all felony sentences imposed in our country are drug related. And there's no upper limit on the severity that a drug related sentence can have, except for capital punishment, except for the death penalty. So aside from that, depending on the type of drugs and the amount that a person is responsible for under the law, they could be in jail for 10, 20 years, even life, depending on the example. So there's a lot of costs that he talks about, social costs that we all bear, whether we drug users or not, to perpetuate this status quo. For example, we have to pay as taxpayers the cost to prosecute and incarcerate and to enforce these anti-drug laws. So suppose that someone goes to jail on a drug sentence. That's actually a major source of overcrowding of prisons, and it creates a backlog in the criminal justice system as well. Here in the state of California, within the past decade, there were decisions that had to be made by the governor to reduce the prison population because there were simply too many people in there, majority of them for drug-related sentences, and in many cases just possession rather than sale or distribution. So when you have too many people in the prison system and then you have to radically slash the number to accommodate more, you end up having to sometimes make haphazard and chaotic decisions about which to release as opposed to which to keep in, and sometimes even somewhat arbitrary decisions. So it's true, and this is just one example to illustrate the point that our anti-drug policy status quo has really clogged our courts, and it does, and this is Husak's position of it, overcrowded our prison system. Now, it's not free to imprison people or to bring the costs of prosecution and et cetera onto the government. So each prisoner costs the Treasury that we are the taxpayers to fund between $10,000 and $40,000 per year, and that's in 1992 dollar figures. Given the rates of inflation, I would say that the figure could be significantly more today. But consider that every prisoner costs between $10,000 to $40,000, just even if we use his data. That's a lot of money, and the average prison sentence for a person with a drug conviction is upward of 70 months. So each new inmate is costing, all of us a lot of money. And that's just to keep them in prison because, we don't just throw someone in a hole and say, here's a cup of water each day. But, we have humane standards of confinement and detention. So, I mean, it's not saying it's like a luxurious thing to do or a way to live. But at the end of the day, we still feed people. We provide, some form of recreation. And if they need medical care, then definitely they're going to receive it, and it's going to be subsidized because they're human beings. And so we don't just leave people to rot or to die of illnesses and things like that. So depending on the individual and the needs they have, their care and upkeep in prison is, significant cost that we all have to pay. Now, more than three-fourths of those that are arrested are not even being charged with distribution or sale, but just possession. And the majority of those cases are themselves for marijuana and not the more, let's say, dangerous narcotic drugs. But the true extent of the war on drugs, this author says, you can't calculate it just by counting up the numbers of dollars that we spend or the number of people that we punish. It's also, he thinks, made significant harm to our civil liberties, our freedoms that we cherish. We become subject to search and seizure of property. Federal loans can be denied to a person. Student loans can be denied to a person. They can have their license taken away, be evicted, be searched, and so forth. So, he understands then that there's a problem in his view, at least with perpetuating the anti-drug status quo, the threats and harms that it does to our civil liberties and our personal autonomy, not to mention the excessive costs and that we have to bear as taxpayers to enforce this given status quo. He wonders, why is it that so many Americans use these drugs? And that's an interesting question, because as he points out, it cannot simply be the addictive power of the drugs, because illegal drug use is less prevalent actually in certain other countries where they're more plentiful supply and where they're less expensive or where they have higher quality than in the United States. So drug use is quite prevalent in our country, even though drugs are not as easy to get and they're more expensive than in some other countries. So it can't just be because they're those reasons why they're more often used in our country. He just kind of leaves it as an open question. When I've had the in-person component to this class, I've often posed this question to the class, and I've had some interesting answers come back. The question is, why is it that so many Americans use recreational drugs? And in his view, he doesn't actually answer the question. He just kind of leaves it as an open question. That's why it's a good topic for conversation. I don't know. There's many different points you could try to identify. For one, in the United States, we have a very restrictive vacation schedule in our work culture. We work some of the longest hours of any developed nation, and that kind of derives back to like a work ethic that was instilled in the people, the Puritans, the original settlers, I guess. But when you don't have much time off, sometimes people have a work hard, play hard mentality, and so maybe that drives up an interest in being intoxicated or recreational drug use. I've heard it argued that our media and entertainment kind of glorifies and glamorizes the uses of drugs and other substances, alcohol too. But of course, there's entertainment and media in every country, I guess, around the world. Of course, we're kind of the epicenter of that. You could also point out the wealth that there exists in our country. But any number of factors to be considered or thought about. It's just an interesting question which I don't have the answer to. But anyways, we can just move on and continue. So the next thing he asks is a question to the reader: why has there been a war declared on drugs? So that's something that he actually thinks is problematic. The terminology used, the language even that is used in talking about the quote-unquote war on drugs. So he finds the label war on drugs to be unhelpful and problematic. Let me try and give you his reasons why. So, okay, so what we're just now going to talk about is this point here that you see written. Douglas Husak, the current author, he finds fault with the label or term used, war on drugs. Now, why is that? When you use the word war, it makes you think in terms of a military metaphor. It's a militaristic way of trying to frame the debate or the topic. And the metaphor of war limits our approach to how we ought to deal with the problem. So, for one, you guys think about this. If it's a war, right, and we're supposed to think of it in terms of war, then it's like we're fighting against an enemy. And that kind of polarizes your responses to something, because you're supposed to show patriotic support to your country during a time of war, and you're supposed to be opposed to the enemy almost on a moral basis. So that transforms people who would otherwise be seen as drug users, maybe some people with drug problems, from our neighbors and friends, to just the enemy. And the enemy in war is something to be destroyed, not something to be negotiated with or bargained with or accommodated. So imagine that we had policies that we wanted to change to modify the criminalization status quo. Any concessions to decriminalization or to, I don't know, going to a medical model instead of a criminal justice model for treating the problem would then be thought of as like waving the white flag of surrender to the so-called enemy. So it kind of biases you against thinking in a complex and nuanced way about the issue when you just consider it to be a war that we are fighting. Failed policies, after all, when they're just thought of in the policy context that are being debated, those can be changed when they don't work out. But a war that you try to change course from is simply a war that you're losing and being defeated in. So he doesn't like the militaristic metaphor that's being employed when we talk about war on drugs. Another thing is that it encourages antagonism to foreigners. And so that's another reason that he doesn't like this label. War, of course, channels and calls to mind images of an invading army coming from somewhere else that needs to be repelled and destroyed. But again, that's going to make you think that maybe the availability of the drug supply is coming from foreign places, and now you kind of advance the war metaphor against other people, which ties into xenophobia, perhaps racism, and other kinds of unhelpful perspectives. Now, sometimes people say that America's in decline. I mean, of course, they've said that in the generation since this man wrote the paper in 1992. We've seen people, running political campaigns built around the premise that America needs to be revived, or that it needs to come back to some golden age that it's lost touch with. And people who feel that America is declining don't know exactly who or what they ought to blame for that perceived decline. Husak claims that drugs provide a convenient scapegoat, and they allow people to avoid the harder, difficult task of considering to what extent their own people or their own government are complicit in the problems that they see in their society. Now, then maybe there is some truth to the idea that drug use contributes to, social decline or individual decline. But Husak then, again, shifts gears, and he says, that can't be necessarily proven. He says most drug use is not so negative, it's conducted responsibly. So he points out something, that a lot of us have a stereotype or a caricature of a person who's using drugs as, I guess, a complete destitute, dependent on society and using welfare payments, maybe poorly educated and out of work, disconnected from society, criminal record, and maybe that's fair to say some cases are like that. But Husak thinks that too much has been made of marginal cases of extreme addicts and users, and there's a lot of more responsible and moderate drug use that doesn't get focused on because of the overhyped attention that we pay to the marginal cases. Another thing that's problematic about the war on drugs metaphor that he points out now is that we have a lot of other social problems too, but we have not attached a war metaphor to them. So where's the war on, I don't know, poverty, or where's the war on racism, or the war on economic inequality, or so on and so forth, the war on climate change? There are a lot of pressing problems out there, but to hype this one up as the target of a war, he thinks that somewhat elevates it beyond other social issues that are just as deserving or even more deserving of attention, because a war is an all-encompassing existential effort that a country has to focus on. But again, having said all that, the larger point to Husak is that we shouldn't necessarily even be considering the drug issue from this more cost-benefit utilitarian perspective, where we try to weigh out, the total harms that it causes and the total benefits that it causes, or that changed policies would cause. The reason that he says we should change from thinking about it in a utilitarian way is because, in his view, again, prohibition of recreational drug use he argues it violates our moral rights, regardless of the consequences, pro or con. That ties again into his view that rights trump utility, that rights take priority over utility. Now, at this stage, he wants to make another quick point, that we shouldn't confuse the term drug with illegal drug. His definition of drug is a lot like the one that we introduced in the last lecture. It's written on page 235. He says, despite the desirability of distinguishing drugs from illegal drugs, there's ample evidence that the public tends to equate them. How is drug defined by those who make the effort to define it? The answer depends on the discipline where the answer is sought. Perhaps the most frequently cited medical definition is any substance other than food, which by its chemical nature affects the structure or function of the living organism. So he proposes to adopt that until a better alternative becomes available. So again, it's just that broad concept of drug, any chemical or, as it says, any substance other than food, which by its chemical nature affects the structure or function of the living organism. Now, when people talk about the war on drugs that we've mentioned, that war has been declared on people not just using drugs in the broad sense, but using a subcategory of drugs, recreational use of drugs. Now, recreational drug use, I mean, it's perhaps a self-evident concept, but since that's the topic of discussion for now, recreational drug use. It is drug use that is intended to promote the pleasure of the user. Okay, so there's clearly drug use that is not recreational, like people using drugs for the sake of illnesses or diseases to treat, prevent, or cure some disease, disability, or illness. There's also other forms of non-recreational drug use. Maybe a person's using it to participate in a religious ceremony, like a religious ritual, or maybe it's a performance-enhancing drug not done for the sake of pleasure, but rather performance. It could, of course, be used in medical procedures anesthetically rather than for its effect while the person is conscious. But recreational use is consumption that's intended for a different reason, specifically the pleasure pursued by the user. And I think probably it's easy enough for people to understand whether they've had those experiences or whether they just imagine what it's like. That people sometimes use those things because they believe that it will cause them to have a better time. Maybe because they want to enhance a good time that they're already having doing something else, or maybe just because they're bored and then the drug use itself becomes the entertaining activity. Almost any drug can be used recreationally, even those that are intended for non-medical use. So he believes that although some drug users that are recreational drug users behave badly, that it would be wrong to apply a policy to all recreational drug users just based on the perceived problems of a few. And this is a principle. Let me put it into our chat. Okay, so it says here, it's wrong to apply a policy to all people in a certain category just because of the perceived problems with a small subset of the people that are in that category. So this is an argument that's sometimes given by people in the debate, the policy debate about gun regulation. So sometimes when there's a, say, mass shooting, a call will be made to restrict sale or access to certain types of firearms or ammo or whatever the case may be. And oftentimes people that defend the status quo and don't want there to be more restrictive policies applied to the gun owners, they say, well, why should it be that law-abiding gun owners, the vast majority of whom don't cause problems will now face more serious restrictions because of the perceived misbehavior of a tiny minority of bad actors that are using these guns for nefarious purposes. And it's the same kind of argument here that Husak is giving when it comes to the recreational drug use. Sure, maybe there are some marginal number of recreational drug users that cause all kinds of social problems, like the ones that have been mentioned before. But why should all the responsible, moderate, and well balanced recreational drug users have to face the same kind of tough penalties? Or why should these penalties even exist? Or these punitive policies exist directed at the whole class of people when it's only a subset of them that are those that even have the perceived problem? So he then talks more in extensive length about the decriminalization movement, and he repeats some of the just empirical data that he's talked about earlier. For example, that the court systems are backed up with drug cases and our jails are becoming overcrowded. He also raises an issue that can't be overlooked, and that is the issue that there does seem sometimes to be implementation of these anti-drug laws in a way that reflects a racial bias or some kind of discrimination, because the implementation of the drug laws, meaning those that actually face drug courts and criminal sanctions, are more often people that are either poorer or minorities. So you might worry that if we're going to give the state this power to imprison people, deprive them of all kinds of other liberties, whether that's the ability to request loans or to seek housing, if we're going to give the state such a strong hand to play, wouldn't you be worried if there was evidence that showed that they were applying the policies along racial lines or in a way that reflects some kind of racial bias? He cites some studies that seem to indicate that there's a problem there, and something that, of course, is not just from 1992 when he wrote this, but a problem that we've been able to identify in the current day as well. So in New York City in 1987, they compiled statistics on the drug users and what their demographics were, and it was shown that 2/3 of drug users in 1987 New York were white, which makes sense because 70% approximately of the U.S. population is white. But consider this: even though 2/3 of the drug users in New York were white, 91% of convicted persons were either black or Hispanic. So if it was a completely egalitarian application of the law, then you'd think that if 2/3 of the drug users are white, then 2/3 of the people convicted would be white, and 1/3 would be non-white. But in fact, we see something completely different, that 91% of those that are absorbing the brunt of the criminal penalties and enforcement efforts are coming from, a 1/3 quotient of those that are even eligible for the penalties, because it's only 1/3 of total drug users that are non-white. Now, sometimes, as we talked about last meeting, diversion programs will be offered as an incentive for people to complete an anti-drug education or treatment plan. If they can then show to the court that they did do so, that can sometimes allow them to have a record struck or not have the penalty applied to their permanent record, so that helps them job seeking, et cetera, in the future. But the diversion options are more often given to people that have more money to spend on lawyers. And so they're usually given to middle and upper class drug users, which again trends more in the socioeconomic and racial category of the majority, and not for the poor, and therefore for a lot of minorities too. So to add to all the other problems that he thinks, the sort of draconian policies brought about by thinking of it in a military term, war on drugs, talking about all the costs that we assume to incarcerate people and to also take away a lot of their liberties in the process. Another problem is the implementation of the laws along racial lines, which disadvantages those that are in the minority and creates further gaps between the more favored and less favored members of a society in a racial sense. So he also says that the war on drugs has another negative effect, which is that it turns people into people by definition criminals, because now they're facing these laws when they're using drugs recreationally that otherwise would have been lawful citizens. So there's so many people that only ever get introduced to the criminal justice system through the aspect of recreational drugs, not because they committed other crimes, not because they committed violent crimes. And so those people would have clean records if these laws didn't exist. Whereas now, under the laws and norms that we have, they can acquire a criminal record, and then that further disadvantages them in the future because there's a high recidivism rate for people that have a criminal record. A lot of people then turn to other crimes because it kind of takes away a lot of the opportunities they had to pursue their goals in life. So I'll read you his thoughts on that on page 237. He says there, so finally and most significantly, the war on drugs is counterproductive in making criminals of tens of millions of Americans whose behavior is otherwise lawful. Most drug users are lucky enough to escape detection, but others are less fortunate. Countless numbers of offenders have been forced to suffer long terms of imprisonment for violating laws that may not be morally justified. And even those that eventually acquit themselves spend tremendous amounts of time and money defending themselves in court. So, if we're weighing costs and benefits, and although he believes there's a moral right to use these drugs, he still argues on a utilitarian basis at times that the costs and benefits don't favor the status quo, that we should decriminalize for that reason as well. When you think about those costs and benefits, you have to consider that being in prison and having your freedom taken away is not a happy thing. And so what's worse for the person? To be threatened by the status quo where drugs are legal, where maybe they could become addicted to drugs, or to have a status quo where the drugs are illegal, but then if they use these recreational drugs, they can have their freedom taken away. You know what I mean? Like, is the solution so-called worse than the problem? If the problem is people use drugs, but the solution is let's throw people in prison even for inconsequential use of certain drugs in small amounts, then maybe the punishment is actually worse than the thing that we're trying to protect against. Because if you had to choose a society where some people are drug addicts and a society where some people are rotting away in prison for a long time for having done nothing other than drugs, what's really the better way to live? So, I mean, that's an interesting point that he raises, and that's my way of kind of putting it into context for you. So he knows there are some arguments for our status quo and that there are arguments, therefore, for criminalization. But he reminds the reader that normally the person that wants to criminalize something has the burden of proof to bear because there's always a presumption in favor of freedom. So if you want to make something criminal, meaning that you want to make it fair for the state to imprison someone for doing it or to fine them or to bring them before a court for doing it, we value our freedom and autonomy so much that there has to be a high justification. We can't say, let's execute people for not turning in their library books, or let's throw someone in prison for 10 years for littering. Because as much as we want to have an orderly society, we know that the punishment has to fit the crime. And in that sense, whenever you propose to criminalize some kind of conduct, you have to really come with an argument that speaks to why we need to have this sanction in the law to advance our mutual best interests. Now, he knows that to make a good argument about criminalization, you'd have to demonstrate that the act causes harm. He thinks the strongest anti-drug policy arguments are going to be based around the potential that it has to harm others. And that's kind of the route that James Wilson took last time, making the case that recreational drug use is harmful, or at least in potential, it's harmful to people other than the one using it. The reason that Husak, at least in theory, agrees that that would be the best type of argument for his opponent to use is because we all can agree and accept on the point that you don't have any moral right to harm other people. You may have a moral right, according to some libertarian view of your rights, to do what you like with your own mind and body, but certainly you don't have any right to hurt other people. So if we could establish that this was conduct that could harm other people, the use of recreational drugs, then that would be probably the most powerful argument. But of course, he's not necessarily convinced that that could be shown. More controversially, you might say that the anti-drug status quo is fair and good because the conduct is harmful to the user themselves. So that's when you start to apply the paternalism principle of criminalization. That would be a person who says, I'm not so sure I can establish that private recreational drug use hurts anybody else, but if it hurts the person that's doing it, or if it could hurt the person that's doing it, then that's enough of a reason right there to make this a criminalized action. So he thinks that you're going to have to establish harm to have a strong argument. The paternalism argument is a little bit more on shaky ground. And he also thinks that the legal moralism argument for our anti-drug status quo would be the weakest of all. if you remember, guys, the legal moralist says that even when you can't show that something is harmful at all, it's still justified to prohibit conduct on the simple basis that it's immoral. Now, the reason that he finds such fault with legal moralism is because, first off, you might have thought this yourself, that the principle that lies behind it is a bit disturbing because it says, let's just enshrine within the law one community's view about the what's right and wrong to do. And normally, if it's a moral question and it's not harm that we are discussing, we normally think that it's probably best to allow people to make their own private judgments about whether that's good or bad. So I might not like someone else's religion or whatever. If I was like really devout member of one religion, I might even say these other people are going to go to hell, or they're not going to like live a good life. God doesn't want them to do that. But in a secular society that's a pluralistic society, as long as their practice of religion of whatever type is not hurting me, you'd think that I have to allow them to do that. Wouldn't it be disturbing if there were people vested with power that were making judgments about what's right and wrong conduct and criminalizing actions just on that basis, even if they couldn't point to any harms that the conduct was causing in a real or material way? So, that's one thing that's disturbing about legal moralism, that it allows morality to be enforced through the law, even when harm can't be established. And in a pluralistic society, we should at least be able to agree that the only thing that we are concerned with respect to being protected by the law is other people's actions taken against us. So he likes the harm principle much better because at least in the harm principle, it guarantees that there's a victim in any criminal act. Why should one view of morality be codified into law, excluding alternatives? And even more to the point, he thinks we should ask this question: why would anyone think that drug use is immoral unless it caused harm? Suppose that you were willing to concede that maybe you don't think drug use, at least certain drug use, caused any kind of harm. Then what would be immoral about it? Is it because it diminishes your mental and physical capacities? Like, is that the reason? Well, he says that can't be true because alcohol or tobacco do the same thing, and they're legally tolerated in our laws. So it can't just be that you're doing an action that might undermine your health, because you can also eat a lot of bad food, or never get the proper sleep, work yourself too much. There's so many things you could do that are dangerous to yourself and even your well-being, but they're not prohibited by the law. So he doesn't think that that's the best reason to explain why it might be thought of as immoral. In his opinion, it must be based then on the alteration of consciousness. The fact that when you take recreational drugs, it changes the way you feel and perceive reality, and it obviously then interferes with your consciousness and changes your conscious state. So here's the question I'm typing into our chat. So he's asking the question: why would a person have the opinion that altering your consciousness is immoral to do? Because he says that when the harm argument doesn't work, when the paternalism argument doesn't work, somebody might revert to this position that it's just immoral to change your consciousness, and we don't want that in our civilization or society. So to reflect our shared sense of morality and right and wrong, we're not going to allow people to alter their consciousness, and that's why we're banning these drugs with the law. But why is it wrong to alter one's consciousness? For example, he says some people alter their consciousness in other ways that don't involve the use of drugs, and we don't penalize them under the law. Suppose that someone runs a lot and they get the runner's high, or suppose that they engage in transcendental meditation and they have altered states of consciousness brought about by that meditation. Those practices are legal and they're not prohibited. So he wonders what it is that lies at the root of this antagonism to the idea of altering your consciousness. But he finally says that he has an answer. He thinks he's identified where this is actually bubbling up from in the culture. And he thinks that it all derives from Christian views about morality. So Husak says, So the view that's written above, that the alteration of consciousness is immoral, he thinks that it kind of comes down to us from a Christian-based perspective on morality. Because if you think about Jesus Christ, right, he's supposed to be the figure that to a Christian you imitate him and you live your life in the spirit of his behavior, trying your best then to live in his model, because he's the perfect example of a moral being. So like, what would Jesus do? You think about what he would do, you try to do the same thing so that you can attain the same kind of good moral character. But notice that in the virtues expressed by Christ's life, it's all about self-sacrifice. It's not about self-indulgence. It's all about altruistic behavior that's done for the service of others. The most extreme case, of course, being the crucifixion of Christ, where in the Christian tradition, they will say that he died for all of their sins, and this is what gives salvation to other people. So sacrifice to the point of one's own death is much different than retreating to the inside state of just pursuing personal pleasure, not for the sake of anyone else. So recreational drug use is non-altruistic, self-indulgent, and done for the sake of personal pleasure. And many people think that that is somehow contrasting to the example given by Jesus. So it falls outside the sphere of the moral perspective of Christian morality. But again, the author Husak wonders why it is that we should try to stand up a Christian sense of morality in the law. This is a pluralistic society, even if it was founded by Judeo-Christian settlers and so on, and Puritans way back in the day. It's a pluralistic society that's not here for only one group of people or one religious background. So in his view, if that's the root cause that leads to the establishment of these anti-drug laws, because it's an effort to try and legally enforce the moral principle that it's wrong for people to alter their consciousness, if that traces all the way back to some kind of Christian basis in morality, he finds fault with that, because a pluralistic society can't stand behind only erecting laws that represent one religion's view about morality as opposed to others. And I'll read that. Here's what he says. On page 238 and 9. On page 238, he says, moral objections to drug use might also be derived from an ideal of human excellence. Drug use might not be conducive to the attainment of a particular conception of virtue. These arguments are frequently endorsed by drug prohibitionists. According to Bennett, another author that he quotes, quote, drug use degrades human character, and a purposeful, self-governing society ignores its people's character at great peril. James Q. Wilson, who we know, confines his virtue-based arguments to illegal drugs. So he said, tobacco shortens one's life, cocaine debases it. Nicotine alters one's habits, but cocaine alters one's soul. Okay, so like, in his heavy-handed way there, Wilson mentioning his view that it's somehow immoral to use recreational drugs. Now Husak answers back. What conception of virtue is employed here? The Christian tradition, for example, identifies virtue with a personal imitation of Christ, emphasizing extraordinary sacrifice in the service of others. According to this tradition, drug use, like any other recreational activity, is suspicious. Recreational activities are non-altruistic and self-indulgent. And he says, it does not follow that the protection of character is an appropriate objective of the criminal law. So, definitely in his view, there's something to do with the Christian conception of morality that treats non-altruistic recreational activities that are done for pleasure as somehow morally suspicious. But it's interesting because it's not just recreational drug use that would then be attached to this kind of stigma, but I guess like, sex done for pleasure or, other pleasure-seeking activities. But again, it's not that consistent, the application of this critique across the board, because if people go skydiving or, rock climbing or something else that they get a thrill from, thrill-seeking activity, maybe bungee jumping, I don't know, that's purely done for the sake of self-indulgent pleasure, but the Christian ethos doesn't seem to pick those things for specific criticism either. I don't know, just some more food for thought, because he brings in the role of Christian morality in standing up this kind of antagonism toward recreational drug use, which he thinks is somewhere in the ballpark of the explanation. So then, a moral right, misinterpretations. At the end, he wants to make one clear point that he's not misunderstood by his readers. Some people may think that by making this big argument that we have a moral right to use drugs and that the arguments in favor of criminalization are not as good as the arguments in favor of legalization, whether it's on utilitarian grounds, purely moral grounds, or reasons having to do with liberties that we should be afforded under the law, irrespective of the religious influence of the law. He wants to make clear, though, that despite all those points, he's not arguing as an advocate for drug use. That's something that's worthwhile to note. So just believing that people have a right to do something is not the same thing as encouraging people to do that thing. So let's focus on this principle really quickly. This is how Husak closes. Maybe I have a better pen, sorry. Not that one. Let's try one more. I'm going to put the word should here. Saying that people should have the right to do X. Where X is just a sort of placeholder for any example that we could plug in for it, and we'll talk about examples in a second. But anyway, saying that people should have the right to do X is not the same as encouraging them to do X. Not the same as encouragement to do X, okay? So here's an important distinction. Saying we should have the right to do something, it's not the same as encouraging people to actually do it. Okay? Now, I know you're watching this as a student, and so that must mean that, you're currently enrolled in school. Do you think you agree with me on this one point, that you have the right to drop out of school, that you have the right to just stop if you don't want to do it anymore? I think we can agree on that. I mean, I'm an educator, and I never dropped out of school. I mean, I stayed in school to the end, getting my PhD and everything. But sometimes people don't finish, and sometimes people just have a change of mind. Now, the thing is, I agree that you should have the right to drop out. But am I telling you that you should do that that's something that you actually ought to do? No. So the right to do something is having the freedom to choose whether you want to do it or not. But encouraging someone to actually do it, that's different. Like, I understand that you have the right to practice any religion that you want, but I'm not encouraging you to practice any specific religion. That's just something I think you have the right to choose on your own. So it's almost like connecting to our previous topic. He says that he wants to be known as pro-choice when it comes to drugs, but not pro-drug use. Okay, so understand the difference, guys. That means that he believes that adults should be able to make their own autonomous decisions about whether or not to pursue the use of recreational drugs for the sake of their own pleasure, as long as they're not harming anybody else. But even if they ought to have the right to make that decision, he's not encouraging anybody particularly to do it. So it's possible to have these two consistent views. I think you have the right to do something, but I'm not encouraging you to do it. And maybe I think you actually shouldn't do it. Like when it comes to dropping out of school, I think you do have the right to drop out, but I'm not going to encourage you to do that because honestly, I think that would not be good for you at all. I would encourage you to stay with it, to stay with school. And with abortion, you can imagine someone who's pro-choice, but they don't advise a particular person to get an abortion. Like, I believe that a person should have the right to choose, but I'm not urging people to get an abortion per se. That's a decision that they have to make on their own, or maybe that's a decision that you may have reasons to believe that they shouldn't make, even if you think that they should have the right to have the choice. So that's how he closes. He says, I've not argued in favor of drug use. It's not like he's saying drugs are good and people ought to do them. Far from it. All he said is that we bear a lot of excessive costs and we're not getting that much back for the war on drugs. He thinks the war on drugs is problematic as a label itself for all the reasons we mentioned earlier. Setting aside the social costs, there's costs to individual autonomy and freedom. that also are side effects and consequences of this anti-drug status quo. And then he says, but regardless of that, we have a right. We have rights to do things as adults if we want, as long as it doesn't affect others. Having said that, it's no encouragement to do it. So I read his last words here. And he says, should the rights of adults be infringed? Okay, so page 239 at the very bottom, leading to 240. He says, a second misunderstanding of my position is as follows. The conclusion that the adult use of recreational drugs is protected by a moral right does not entail that drug use is beyond moral reproach. The exercise of a moral right may be subject to criticism. Perhaps recreational drug use is morally tainted. Let me get the right quote here. I remain skeptical that a virtue-based objection to all recreational drug use can be defended, although no one should be confident until some philosopher attempts to do so. In any event, some instances of recreational drug use are morally objectionable, beyond those in the special circumstances in which users create an impermissible risk of harm to others. I'm getting the wrong quote. Let me read you the proper part. Let me just get this here. Yeah, okay, sorry. It's on the earlier part of 239, if you don't mind. He says, the conclusion that adults have a moral right to use drugs recreationally does not amount to advocating drug use. Here we go. The distinction between encouraging conduct and conceding that adults have a right to engage in it might seem too obvious to say, except that many prohibitionists have not failed to recognize it. This basic distinction is widely appreciated in many other contexts. Adults have the moral right to preach communism or to practice Buddhism, yet no one who defends this right would be misunderstood to recommend a conversion to communism or Buddhism. It's like the freedom of speech thing. So I believe that you have the right to say something that I completely disagree with, but of course I'm not going to encourage you to say those things because I don't agree with them. It's the difference between recognizing your freedom to choose to do something and personally standing behind the thing that you're doing. So anyway, continuing on. One of the most widely voiced objections to the proposal to repeal laws against drugs is that it would express the wrong symbolism. Yeah, but I think we got the key quote there. Now, the last word I wanted to add to the discussion as we finish this meeting here is he says, we could still encourage people to not do drugs even if they were legal. We could still have anti-drug education efforts. We could still try to preach that people should take careful consideration of these drugs. But when it comes to anti-drug education, he proposes something that's probably never really been tried before, at least not in our country. He says that effective anti-drug education should learn a lesson from sex education. Because in most cases, when people are exposed to sex education lessons, the message is not just be abstinent, just don't do it, and then you don't have to worry. I mean, fair enough, there are some communities where that's the primary message, but for the most part, it's told that if you're doing it, or if you think of doing it, then you should try to do it responsibly, moderately, and protect yourself. That's an effective message because it acknowledges that some people are bound to do the act, and we want to mitigate harm if they choose to. With respect to anti-drug education, he thinks that we can't just preach an abstinence-only message in the same way that you can't do that with effective sex education. So just say no is not going to work, he thinks, because some people are bound to do it, and those people are never going to hear about how to use recreational drugs within limits, moderately, or to be responsible, and to have checks and balances in their own conduct. So he thinks that responsible drug use is something that should be studied and that there should be some effort given to indicate to people how to be more moderate, not just telling them to abstain completely. Now, of course, that's not encouragement to use drugs, but it acknowledges the reality that a certain percentage of people will do it. And we never hear those messages. Nobody ever talks about like, well, if you do it, be careful to do X, Y, and Z, or to not do X, Y, and Z. Oftentimes, the limits of anti-drug outreach efforts kind of just are curbed at just don't do those things. And, by the way, they're illegal. But knowing that some number of people will do them, he thinks that it would be valuable to try and study the behavior of responsible drug users and then use that as a model to explain maybe how some other habits could be attainable too. Okay, so that's about it for today. Well, at least for this one lesson. We have one last lesson on the topic of drug law and drug policy. The next one is from Gerald Dworkin, and it's called Paternalism. It's not so much specifically about the drug topic, but more broadly about the concept of paternalism itself and why, at least in his view, some types of paternalistic interference into a person's liberty may be justified. Now, of course, that has relevance to the drug topic because a lot of people think that the anti-drug laws are paternalistic in spirit because some think that they are intended to protect the drug user from their own behavior more than to protect other people, who a lot of people don't think have much connection to the drug users and they're not necessarily affected by them. So Dworkin's going to argue that paternalism can sometimes be justified, and therefore, by extension, it could be argued that some types of anti-drug laws can be justified because they may be paternalistic in nature. So then, guys, I'm going to just close this stream, and I appreciate all your attention and time. I'll be in touch with you guys, and I'll talk to you soon. We'll be in touch over the weekend as I tell you all about how to get ready for the upcoming midterm exam. But anyway, use the study guide that I distributed. Focus on the questions that are listed there. There's going to be a set number of them that will appear on the test, and you just don't know which ones that I'll choose, but you'll ultimately have to answer around 9 or 10 of them. And, if you gave like a solid paragraph or whatever, give or take, a little bit, depending on the individual, you'd probably have a good score on that individual response. But focus on the study guide, keep doing the readings, watch all the lecture content, and contact me if there's anything else that I can help you with. But for now, take it easy, and I'll see you soon. Okay, bye.